lot of really shady arms trafficking stuff and financial criminality, and they have no interest in getting deep in the weeds there.
Because that exposes other people.
Absolutely. Basically, what I argue in my book is that the network behind Epstein, and the reason why there's so many powerful people in this group, is because it's born out of this union that occurred during World War II between organized crime and the nascent U.S. intelligence apparatus. Which, of course, there was a lot of British involvement with that in the creation of the CIA and the OSS and all of that in World War II. That alliance officially happened. It's known as Operation Underworld, even though the U.S. intelligence community denied it for several decades. They now admit it. But that alliance, it was justified out of wartime necessity. We have to team up with the mob to win the war, right? But after the war, the alliance provably continued. So ultimately, essentially what happened then is that a lot of these rackets that were previously organized crime, arms trafficking, drugs trafficking, sex trafficking, prostitution, whatever, became, rackets of intelligence services.
In what way?
Well, I mean, there's a litany of evidence of the CIA being involved in drug trafficking and arms trafficking via illegal means for many decades. And a lot of those networks that the CIA used go back to the same nexus. I mean, that's basically what volume 1 of my book is about.
But why would they be in bed with these criminals?
It's great business. The CIA and the OSS were really mostly Wall Street people.
That's the sound of an American oil company hard at work.
And bankers, and it was great business for them to team up with these people. So basically, it's a new market. It's a illegal market with state protection, and so the CIA more often than not has gone over the competition for those markets, and that's why you have all these scandals, but no accountability for the CIA being involved in drug trafficking, arms trafficking, and all sorts of scandals over the years. But there's never been any accountability since there was an effort with it at the during the Church Committee in the late 70s, but since then the CIA investigates itself and exonerates itself every time.
Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to get my head around this. So whilst the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, is meant to be protecting U.S. interests abroad,
they define U.S. interests, I think, as something than what the American public is. So if you look at the CIA's earliest coups, their earliest regime change operations, they were done on behalf of very powerful multinational corporations like Anglo-American Oil in Iran and the United Fruit Company in Guatemala, some of the earliest examples. So to them, protecting U.S. interests is protecting the interests not necessarily of the American people, but of massive American-based, multinational corporations.
So it's all economic defense,
in a sense.
Arguably economic defense, because wasn't the Guatemala? Didn't they remove a kind of socialist leader who wanted to return land to the Guatemalans?
Yeah. Well, that historically has been the justification for a lot of it, and a lot of the justification was sort of Cold War era stuff. We don't want this leader to become close to the Soviets, ergo we must remove him from power. But, the means of that have been pretty scandalous, especially if you look at what came downstream of some of those governments in Latin America, for example. Chile being a notable example where, Henry Kissinger and the CIA in 1973 orchestrated a coup against Salvador Allende, and then Augusto Pinochet takes over. Mm-hmm. It's obviously a still very sore spot in Chilean politics, but objectively, there's a lot of things Pinochet did that are really indefensible. He teamed up with a German pedophile guy who ran this place called Colonia Dignidad with his government's approval. A lot of people tied to the Pinochet government were involved in basically trafficking babies that were stolen from their mothers and then sent to adoption agencies at the U.S. People made money off of this, and nothing was done. And he had a lot of really shady bank accounts, did shady arms deals. So, okay, the socialist guy is gone, but, was it really did it really justify all this other stuff? I mean, I'm probably going to get in trouble for getting into Chilean stuff just because, people will accuse me of defending one side or the other. But I think, obviously, Pinochet engaged in behavior that was really, really bad and should, And
it's interfering with the democratic process.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, people elect a leader, and then the CIA comes in and deposes them and puts in a dictator. I mean, they've done this around the world over and over again. And I mean, it's not even, they've also interfered in elections throughout Europe. They engaged in things like Operation Gladio, where that was basically teaming up with the Italian mafia, interests of the Vatican, and the CIA-backed terror groups in Europe. Those terrorist activities were blamed on left-leaning people in order to get people to vote with right-leaning parties to prevent European countries from affiliating themselves with the Soviet Union. But would they have done that? I don't know. I mean, it was a preemptive thing. And so, eventually, but again, this is how the CIA justifies the stuff to itself. I would argue that a lot of it was about economic interests. And at the same time, a lot of these actors were involved in sort of backrooms deals with, either Soviet intelligence or Chinese intelligence or the Chinese military. That's sort of what the Chinagate thing ultimately circles back to. And
tell me about that.
Really quick, I want to bring up this point. So Samuel Pisar, a very close friend of Robert Maxwell, who I'm sure we'll get into later, he was a lawyer, among other things. He testified to Congress in the early 70s about what he saw happening, and he talked about the rise of the trans-ideological corporation, where U.S. multinational corporations were basically entering into all these joint ventures and becoming extremely entangled with state-owned companies of the communist East in Russia and China. And he said that this was creating a new economic system of governance that was making the nation state irrelevant. And this is in the early 70s. And a congressman was like, well, do you think this is a bad thing? And he was like, not necessarily. And he was actually at the forefront of making that happen. And a lot of these people, including people like Robert Maxwell, did try and further that kind of vision, So ultimately, if that was happening at the early 70s and they admitted it, a lot of these actors that justified things out of the necessity of the Cold War, just like they justified it with out of the necessity of World War II, it really doesn't add up with what the public justification is.